Dr. Sam Dubé here once again on behalf of Agora Media and the Toronto Business Journal, and it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Henry Garfield Gar Pardy with us today. Mr. Pardy, Gar, as you insisted I call you, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So Gar actually retired as the Director General of Consular Affairs Bureau for the Department of Foreign Affairs here in Canada, which is a very, very impressive sounding title. And I took a look at the countries that you've served in, the people that you've known over the last several decades, and it literally reads like a who's who from these decades, Gar. You are the author of a couple of books that we will discuss. The second one in particular, one is called Afterwards, which is a compilation of 600 to 700 articles that you wrote for various publications over the years. And I think most of them were done after you retired in 2003. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And specifically today, we'd like to talk about your book, China in a Changing World. So certainly China has been a major focus on the international scene for the last several years, and in particular now during the COVID-19 pandemic, during which time this interview is taking place. Actually, it is currently January of 2021, and welcome all of you for joining us here for this interview. So, Mr. Pardy, Gar, I'm sorry, it's so hard for me to get used to saying that. Can you give us a little background about yourself? Because I found it so intriguing. We're going to start off in the far east of Canada. Can you tell us about your background, please?
Yeah, the family, it's from Newfoundland. As with most people in Newfoundland, we're all from the bays. Families were fishermen, one part of the family in Trinity Bay, the other part in Bonavista Vista Bay. My grandfather, he was a small man. He decided that he had enough fishing. So this is at a time when one of the iron ore mines were opening in Newfoundland. He was a small man, so he got hired to go into an iron ore mine. And because of the size, he was able to build small railroads that were being built in the mines. And from that experience, and that overlapped with the building of a railroad across Newfoundland, which no longer exists, by the way. And the family moved over to being railroaders. And on my father's side, just about everybody in the family at one time or another worked for the railroads. I decided to take a different direction, and for a while worked with the Weather Service of Canada in Gander, and then I went to Goose Bay for a while, and then Frobisher Bay for a number of years, and from there then on to school, and then from there went into the Foreign Service. And with the Foreign Service, of course, you're overseas a fair bit at the time, about 50% of the time, and places like India there, in Kenya, in Washington, and then in Central America, and then back to Ottawa for the final years. And all of those places had their own unique experiences. Stayed out of Europe for a variety of reasons, but places like India, this was the time when relates to the subject today, the China book, of course. It was in the aftermath of the war between India and China, and which still lingers on in one way or another. It relates to a border dispute in the Maldives. And then when we were in East Africa, Idi Amin was the man that strutted the stage, and it was basically kicking at the British, and making light of their role in Africa. And then we ended up in Washington, where for the last 2 years of Jimmy Carter, and then the first 2 years of Ronald Reagan as president. And let me tell you, the changes today that are going on in Washington are monumental. Those were really fundamental changes, because I can't think of two other men in American politics, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, that were the opposites of each other, although both in their own way were fairly successful. But Reagan perhaps really set the stage for a lot of the things that are going on in Washington today. Then a little later, we went to Central America, where the Canadian government, this is the time of Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Clark, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and they decided that Canada should become a full member of the OAS. As you may recall, we never did join for a number of years, became a member, and then they wanted to play a large role in terms of the peace effort. But the presidents of the region were getting in the way, Oscar Arias in particular. And so we went to 3 years in Central America. We put in a peacekeeping mission, a Canadian men and Canadian soldiers down there. We had 800 of them, I guess, altogether. Supervised elections and all of that sort of thing. And really changed, because in those days, Central America played a very large role, Nicaragua in particular, El Salvador being the other. Guatemala still playing a bit of a role and still having trouble getting its act together. And so we played a role, and sort of the wars ended and pretty much put Central America basically back on a reasonable path for in terms of their own futures. And they're still struggling, there's no doubt about that. But yet the wars ended. And I think that when wars are going on, everything else basically stops. And there we have came back to Ottawa and then went into the job, which is a global job in foreign affairs, where all of your work relates to all countries in the world. And that just fitted in very nicely with my own approach. One day you have to deal with sentiments in the Middle East, or the wars there, or you have Asia or Latin America. They're all over the map, quite literally in terms of the work. And you're never quite sure what's going to face that day when you're going to work. And I was there for about 10 years and then decided it was time to retire and take it easy for a while. But you don't take it easy after you've lived that kind of a life. And I've been writing ever since.
Gar, before we get into some specifics about your latest book, I wanted to ask you a more personal question about what circumstances, individuals, and passions within yourself inspired you to go into the foreign service, because it's very clear that you have a passion for this.
Yeah, our family grew up when I was a teenager. I was born just as the Second World War was getting away. So it was getting underway within a month or so of it starting. Actually, that's when I was born. But we moved to Gander quite early on, and the family did. And Gander, of course, was an airport that was really didn't exist in 1935. But within a few years, it was one of the largest airports in the world, and certainly with the role that it played during the war in terms of the ferrying of aircraft across the Atlantic. And then post-war period, of course, the growth in civil aviation was just phenomenal. Before the war, it was a bit of a risk to fly the Atlantic, but after the war, it really came into its own, and this is where international aviation got underway. And Gander was at the center of everything that was going on. And that sort of prompted an interest in the world when you were dealing with Pan American or Trans-World Airlines or Lufthansa or all of the other airlines coming through, and the people that you were meeting there. That sort of generated an interest in the world. And we had a first-rate library in Gander too. And the librarians were always nice to kids when they dropped in, and were very pleasant people, and gave you an edge on really understanding the world out there. And it has stayed with me all my life, and I don't, while I'll die, I was thinking about what's going on in China or what's going on in Central America, but that's the nature of the life when you take up this kind of a vocation.
To your book now, and I found it really intriguing. You laid some groundwork based on the First World War and the Second World War, and your support for the United Nations. And one of the things you mentioned in the First World War was that the victors seemed to want to punish the losers, and that set up the stage for the Second World War. And that after the Second World War, the victors had learned lessons from their treatment of the losers in the First World War, and were smarter, possibly more compassionate, and that the cooperation and the treatment with the losing sides laid the groundwork for many of the institutions today, and certainly financial institutions today. And you go on to talk about your support for the United Nations and how we have to redefine what it means to be peacekeeping, because you mentioned three interventions in particular. I believe it was the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and you'll have to remind me of the third one. Well, that failed, drastically failed, because there wasn't any peace to keep in the
Exactly.
countries. So could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I sort of, I mean, you start with
Yeah, my
history.
questions are long-winded. I apologize. So,
Oh,
so
no, no,
go
not
ahead.
at all. I mean, the one thing you do accept, I think, when you deal with a whole bunch of countries around the world is linearity with in terms of policy and what they do in the world. You mentioned sort of the First World War really was a war unto itself. It came about at a time when the horses were being retired and mechanization and the guns that were coming into play in terms of the sheer number that died. But the policy, if you go back 50 years previous or 40 years previously into 1870, the Germans and the French had a real go of it. And the German army marched down the Champs-Elysees in Paris, and the French never got them over. And so 1914 comes along, and in the aftermath, peace treaty was negotiated or was worked on in terms of Paris in 1919. Margaret Macmillan has written a wonderful book on that period, a Canadian historian, Paris 1919. But the French very much went into those peace negotiations really wanting to get everything back that they possibly lost as a result of the earlier German invasion. And the Americans were very tenuous in terms of their approach to the war. They came in at the tail end of the war and really didn't play such a. Wilson was a sick man during part of the negotiations, and that the ideas that were talked about there were two sets. One was this payback, and let's get everything we can out of the losers here, which is really became the dominant feature in the negotiations. And the other element was the tag end of colonialism was starting during this period. All of the colonies, the Brits were in their ascendancy, and and all of the European powers, which had colonies in Africa and Asia, all wanted to maintain that system. It was a very rich system for them. So that got perpetuated in those negotiations as well, even to the point where a lot of the issues out of the Middle East today were cemented or created actually by the peace agreement that was negotiated in Paris in 1919. The countries of the Middle East didn't become exactly colonies, but they were mandated territories once the League of Nations was created. But the League of Nations the Americans decided they would not become a member, and as a result of that, the League of Nations never really got organized, even though a lot of the ideas that were evident there were ones that were picked up later. But if you fast forward into the Second World War, and in terms of Roosevelt is there, the Americans were directly involved, particularly after, even before 1941 and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Even before that, the American industrial might was coming into play to support Europe in terms of the wars that were going on there. And but in particular, and I tried to make this clear in the book, is the role played by the Americans in all the four conferences that were held that predated the ending of the war in 1945 were all mostly held in Washington. There was one or two in Moscow and two other places, but they were all in Washington. The Americans designed a system that they were comfortable with, and as a result of that, we ended up with the UN organization, which in its own way is still fundamental to the kind of world that we still wanted. But the one thing that, and you see a little bit of this coming into play now as far as China is concerned, the Americans, of course, designed the system for their advantage. All victors do this sort of thing, the system that was created. And we all signed in. We all thought that there were advantages for all countries that became members of the UN. When you realize that there were only 52, I think, countries that attended the first meeting of the United Nations in 1945. We're at now 193 or something like that.
South
So
Sudan,
it
yeah.
started to soak up this whole business. And the Americans designed it. But the problem that you have today, China is arriving on the scene. Now, Moscow, by the way, incidentally, was part of that process because Moscow was an ally of the United States and the rest of us in the Second World War. But things have changed subsequently to all of that. But they, the Chinese, and you look at a lot of the large elements in Chinese policy today, is to try to create new institutions or change the existing institutions that were created in 1945 so that they are more akin to the kind of work that, or the kind of reach that China has out into the world now, because China traditionally has never been a world power in the sense that the Europeans became world powers or the Americans became world powers. The Chinese have always been very hesitant. They looked on neighboring countries as tributary countries. They were powerful, and other countries paid them honor by giving them money. And if you look at Chinese history, you find that element there. They had a navy in the 15th century. That was
1421. I was intrigued by that book when it came out.
Exactly. You see, if you go back, and we've tended to forget about these elements in China because what happened from when the Europeans decided that they were going to try to change China, if you like. They never became a colony, but the European influence in there, and particularly where you got the British in terms of the Opium Wars. The Brits stole, in a way, this is commercial stealing. They stole tea from China and then turned Northeast India into a major tea plantation. And then, you had the whole business then. At the same time, they decided that opium was a good product to sell in China, and look what happened. So all of these things interrelate and turn. So we end up with a situation today where China there's no doubt where it's going. It's got a continuity of leadership now that's 50, 60 years. And it's less, how can I put it, once Mao and his ideas got dismissed as being dead enders, you've got a bunch of people there that basically know what they want to do in the world, and they've got the resources, they've got the people, they've got the talent, and they're going to play a role. And the idea that the rest of the world can sort of oppose this in any effective way, in the way that we tried to contain Russia of the Soviet Union in the late 40s. This containment ain't the way it's going to work. And one of the things I do in the book is there's a couple of chapters there where I look at China and its relationship with other countries around the world. There isn't a part of the world that China does not show up and have some influence, whether it's Brazil or Argentina, or it's in Africa. And the other day, in the middle of the current dispute with China over a variety of issues that the Americans have been talking about and pushing. But what did the Europeans do? They signed a major investment agreement with China. I mean, this was about a week ago. So the other countries are going their own way, and the Americans are the system that the Americans created for their advantage is what's under attack today. And the Americans have got to come to realize that they can't go back to where things were. You've got to take into account the way things are today. And it's an economic model that you have to deal with more than the political one to some extent.
Gar, I've got so many questions for you now. Like, honestly, like you just opened up a can of worms here. But I mean, I was originally gonna ask.
It's a big subject. I mean, it's an enormous subject.
I mean, I wanted to ask you about, what was the European influence on the formation of the CCP, right? Like at the end of World War II, you mentioned in your book how China was kind of fed up with this infiltration. My mother was there during the Japanese occupation and during World War II, and so it hits close to home. But you mentioned that influence, and you're actually, just to touch on what you mentioned just now, you're very critical of the way the U.S. system. I guess you're calling it a system here now. In the book, you were saying how, you know, the idea of hegemony and dominance, and the way that the Soviet Union, they attempted to contain them, it's not going to work with China. You mentioned originally writing the book in order to determine or analyze, at least analyze the situation with the U.S. Extradition request for Ming Wanzhou and the two Michaels, right? Michael Covert and Michael Spavor, I believe.
Spavor, yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned how the rule of, you quoting the rule of law, and not wanting to, what was the term you used? It was how we were trying to justify dealing with China doesn't hold any water. It doesn't hold any water with Beijing anymore, right? And you, in the book, you actually list, like, you enumerate steps that need to be taken. And it's a very global perspective, in how traditionally the U.S. has dealt with other countries. And you go on to critique what has happened recently. And one point in particular was that in the middle of this last year, the U.S. Withdrew from funding the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
Can you comment to that, actually? Can you comment to that? I do have questions about that.
Yeah. I was always intrigued by a statement that Napoleon made a number of years ago, which basically said, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. And countries make mistakes. And the thing is, when you're making mistakes yourself, you're in trouble before you even start, in terms of trying to rearrange an incident. The United Nations, the rest of the world wants the United Nations. I think the Americans do as well. They were the creators of this institution. And I think they will, and there's a large element of support in the United States for this organization. And I think that support, once the reality, and China has created a reality for the UN that is probably more powerful today than it was 10 years ago. So, and China played the role right in becoming a member of the World Trade Organization. And the Americans are being bloody minded right now on that organization, preventing that organization from acting effectively. And the rest of the world needs it, because it is the basis by which, in effect, we trade back and forth with each other. Countries have come and gone on various specialized agencies, but something as fundamental as a World Health Organization, which predates the UN, the efforts to create, in effect, a commonality in the rest of the world to deal with some of these dread diseases, it's been there. I think it goes back to the time when they created the International Postal Organization, for example. But all of these ideas were there in play, and they got rolled into the UN. And you need the UN to provide, in effect, the context in which, in effect, we deal with each other on these kinds of issues. And there is nothing more pressing right now than when you get a nasty virus that comes along and really decimates the rest of the world. I was involved in SARS for the months that we dealt with it. The SARS, gets referred to in somewhat the same terms as we got with COVID today, but SARS was nothing like it. So SARS, we had 40-odd people die in Toronto, but it was so localized, it didn't have the lethality or the transmissibility that we have, say, with COVID. And you've got to have some sort of an organization that sits at the center that basically provides for coordination. Governments, by nature, don't want to tell people when they do something wrong. And you see China going through this right now. There's some sense that China has got something. There's a group of WHO officials in there right now that maybe they might come up with some ideas here. But some of the outlandish charges that have been made, the one thing that China did do, and it was on January the 11th, they released, in effect, the genome for this particular virus. And it's on that basis that the medical researchers around the world, that's just about a year ago today. Now that's why we have now vaccines against this particular deal on that one thing that China did a year ago. Now they've been playing around with a lot of other stuff at the edges here, but the one thing that was important to control this particular disease was that genome, and the fact that it became available. And every medical scientist that we talk to today around the world will tell you it is that one fact that was important a year ago. China is, how can you put it, is changing. I'm sure if you've had any dealings with it, it's not the China back in 1972 when Trudeau and Canada, we decided, well, 68, I guess, we decided that we would, the relationship of Taiwan sort of representing 800 and close to 1 billion people in the United Nations made no sense. So Trudeau himself in 68, we started negotiating. We were recognized Beijing in 70. And what happened 2 years later, Nixon did the same thing, and Kissinger. These were people who looked at the world as it was and said that there's no way that we can have a stable world when a country like China is on the outside looking in. We've got to bring it into the innards, if you like, of the way the world operates. And generally speaking, I think China has been a reasonable participant. Given its power, I would think, because the other sort of thing that one can talk about here is the South China Seas. Everybody says what China's doing, creating islands there, turning it into a bit of a Chinese sea. But you make a comparison, and the Americans, of course, are making the most noise about all of this and freedom of navigation and another. But can you imagine if China showed up in the Caribbean in the same way that the Americans show up in the South China Sea and the seas around China? We'd have a war on our hands. China has been, in that sense, I think, fairly prudent. It's brash right now, largely because of the kind of nonsense that they've had to put up with from the Americans, from Mr. Trump, more than President Trump, more than anything else. But it's got to come back in, and I think that the rest of the world has one policy that we have to agree on, is that we've got to keep China involved in the organizations that are important to us and really are important to China, and they recognize it as such. So that is the game here that has to be played right now. And maybe in the next 10 days or so, we'll start hearing some noises out of Washington that will reflect that more so than has been the case in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, because it looks like the administration is shifting, and we're going to have President Biden in the U.S. Within a few days. So I'm not going to mention some of the claims against the WHO and such, because I want to focus on what your strategy is in dealing with China. So I would like you to break down some of these steps. You mentioned a few terms that I found rather intriguing, and you coined a term here. First of all, you talked about a revalidation of global will. Can you talk to that for our viewers momentarily? What you mean by that, a revalidation of global will?
Well, and I guess the starting point for that was the global will that was evident in the post-Second World War period. There was a genuine effort really to create the UN so that it represented will on a global basis. And it is that will, it's not, because when we talk about globalization, we tend to concentrate on the negative sides, and there are negative sides too. If you've got a machine shop down in Toronto down there, and suddenly everything that you've done can be done in northern China at half the price, this is going to tarnish you're out there as far as globalization is concerned. But what is more important is not so much those individual things. They have to be dealt with, and they are serious. There's no doubt about that. But more importantly is the will for countries to come together and negotiate really answers to those problems as and when they occur. China is relatively new, but the fact that China has been such a success economically has as much to do with American policy as it has to do with the policy of the Chinese government. I mean, this is the reality. I mean, China has been, what, 7,000, 8,000 years, depending on how far back of the part of history. And in that sense, I mean, the reality is there. And this is one of the lines I use in the book, is that the use of the term exceptionalism. I mean, the Americans claim exceptionalism for themselves, meaning that anything that they do is as a result that they are exceptional as far as all other countries are concerned. But I mean, American exceptionalism is so thin in terms of the rest of the world that there's a real problem here. Whereas the Chinese also use exceptionalism as well, but their exceptionalism is based on a history. And if you go back and read the history of technology, as it's the world of technology as we use it today, 90% of it has its origins in China.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking not today, you're talking 1,000 years ago.
True genius.
Yeah, it is amazing what you find. There's a series of books that was done by a man back in the post-war period, where I think he did 12. They're still being published every day, where the research, and these are done by outsiders, by the way, not done by the Chinese themselves, right, where the research is done, and they document. We all know gunpowder and a few other things, but something as simple, and I mentioned it in the book here, the Chinese ships in the 15th century, that the Admiral Zheng Yi.
Yeah, 8 times the size of Columbus's ships, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, one of them was about the third size of an American aircraft carrier today. But what the Chinese, I mean, that root technology, it's so simple. They developed the idea that you build watertight compartments within the boat. And, the Titanic, we remember, and what happened when the Titanic sank was the nature of the accident was that 4 or 5 of those watertight compartments got thrown into the sea. But something as simple as that gave you the ability to build a boat that was safer than anything else that was there. Most of the European boats were punts, as we called them in Newfoundland, something that you roll around the harbor in the afternoon. But the Chinese, they got this background here that is unbelievably rich in terms of that interest and the sheer number of people. a billion 4 people. We can't understand it. The 4 at the end, the 400 million. Well, what are we? We're pushing 40 million. It's about 1%.
Yeah.
And whereas China is there as a reality, and I'm not saying that the Chinese are, not any. Their motives are to look after themselves, but what our job is going to be is to get them to come into the system that has been created and the world has agreed upon. The United Nations is there, and to get them to play a role within the context of the United Nations, because without that, then we're back in dog eating dog, and that's not where we need to go in this day of the kind of weapons that we have available to us.
No, and you know what? Granted, Canada's pushing 40 million, and they've got that 0.4 on the end of their 1 billion, and we're 10% of that. But what about the elephant in the room here, Gar? We haven't talked about the system, the governmental system, and how it treats its people, right? And I think that sticks in the craw of a lot of democratic world leaders, and particularly the States, which was founded on these principles of freedom, right? And which are, they're also founded in Christian principles as well. So how do we reconcile that with the role that China plays on the world stage? And I know you're looking at a bigger picture here and like, okay, here's China. This is what's happening with them. This is how we need to deal with them. And I understand that's what you're saying, but how do you reconcile that with what's happening inside and alleged human rights violations and things like?
The the concern, one of the things you've got to be very careful of when large countries get into disputes is that, and this is where the media comes in, there's been more stories written about China in the past year, and I follow it quite closely, than had been in 1 year. And most of them have been negative stories, and all with some degree of reality attached to them. But there's a piling on that you get here, and it's part of the tactics that you use. And I don't think the Soviet Union learned to live with it until the point where they collapsed because their economic system just evaporated underneath them. And when you throw in a 10-year war in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union engaged in, which was just as nasty for them as Vietnam was for the Americans, it is this business of time that you need here. The fact that today, every country in the world clamor to have Chinese tourists show up, in their countries. I can go back 10 years and most the Chinese government didn't allow basically anybody to leave the country. It was just not going to happen. That was the simple. And now they have agreements with everybody. But people are, and I guess I come back to systems of government, and there's no doubt that the Communist Party of China is, it's been around, it's survived, it goes back to the 1920s. They disappeared during the worst of the Second World War. They went up north, and this is the Mao and his long march. They went off and set the war out. And then Chiang Kai-shek and his people decided that they were going to be the dominant political force in China, and it didn't work out for them. The Americans, to a certain extent, provided less support than some people thought was necessary for them. So the Communist Party is there, and the Communist Party is a nasty organization, but it's better today than it was when Mao was running things. In terms of there's an evolutionary process that is underway in China as far as the political system is concerned. And there is a lot of stories that you see if you follow the press closely, the disputes that go on vis-a-vis farmers or workers in other parts of China, vis-a-vis the Communist Party or the local representatives of the Communist Party. There is a ferment within China that is quite significant. But in terms of the benefits that have accrued to the Chinese people under this system of government, it is unbelievably rich. This is the time when most people in China, it's unbelievable how rich they are compared to what they were 50 years ago. So it's a system that has provided a tremendous amount of benefit to the people of China. But the thing is, you can't keep everybody down on the farm, and people travel and people change, and you get things going on. But the change it's got to be centered in China itself. There's no point in the rest of us out here saying, telling the Chinese what they should be doing. That is not what's going to happen here. They're going to work it out for themselves, and it's going to be an evolutionary process, and it's not going to be early. But the more the Chinese are involved in the world, and if they're involved in the world in terms that we all can understand and appreciate, then that's when the kind of changes that we would like to see happen in China. It is not going to happen as a result of the Canadian Parliament passing a resolution saying there's nasty things going on up in Zhejiang. So, that is where the change is going to occur. It's not going to occur because of pressure from the outside. And we need to get them back onto the kind of path that the previous leader had post-Mao, where there was a clear interest in becoming part of the world. They've slipped off that particular road, and the trick is to get them back on that road.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna touch on that in a moment. just to backtrack a moment, we were talking about how the rule of law and it's the non-payment of ransoms. These are the policies that are dominating in the dealing with China in terms of the prisoners, right? And you proposed as one of the steps a prisoner exchange
Yeah.
between Ming Wanzhou and the two Michaels, for instance, as a way to um, remedy the situation and in future dealings of the same nature. Can you elaborate on that for us, Gar?
It's the only, I mean, the policy has been, and I've been quite critical of the government, Canadian government here, is it's within our authority to solve this particular dispute based on the fact that we're doing an exchange. Kidnappings, hostage situations, which is probably a better way to do this, but fundamentally it's kidnapping. They occur all the time. In the last 2 months, the Americans have done these kinds of exchanges where their citizens have been locked up in Iran, in Yemen, and where's the other one? I think it's in Syria. And the Americans, despite all of the nastiness that you see, the Americans in back rooms have sat down with all three governments, which wanted their citizens who were in American jails to come home, and that's how the Americans did it. This happens all the time. I mean, kidnappings is still going on, although it doesn't have the international flavor that it had 20 years ago. But it's been going on. But in effect, when you've got a situation where you control the key elements in a dispute, then the very first thing you do is solve that dispute. And this is it's a big issue for the people involved, but it's totally within the authority of under Canadian law.
Yeah, you mentioned that. This could be
Yeah,
done under
Canadian law.
law.
You leave the Extradition Act. I mean, the Minister of the Extradition Acts are laws, but they're laws basically based on politics. It's not the way the rule of law is, we say, between you and I as citizens of this country, how we manage and how the government manages their relationship with us. But in terms of it, when you've got extradition, you've got a citizen of another country, you're talking about a political matter here, essentially. And under the Canadian Extradition Act, it is up to the Minister of Justice to decide whether or not this is in Canada's advantage. And the Americans are not going to be upset with this. I mean, the courts, and we've turned down extradition requests from the Americans. There's nothing much going on here.
Really?
So you sit down and you make the offer, Madam Ming, you can go back home. Beijing, we want our two Michaels back here in the process. It doesn't say it's guaranteed it's going to happen, but generally speaking, those exchanges happen and all countries engage in them. It's nothing specific to Canada. Why we have been so difficult on this?
Yeah, why?
Issue, that's what I don't understand. The Prime Minister, and I've talked to any number of people about this. This is a policy that the Prime Minister has adopted and is not going to change. And in the meantime, we're into the third year now that the two Canadians have been locked up in China. And Madame Meng, she's back in court again. She's trying to get her bail conditions lessened today. But this could be over in a matter of weeks, just by saying, okay, let's do an exchange here.
But Gar, then
it's off the books because you don't know what you're going to have to deal with tomorrow.
Right,
as long as this thing is there, you can't go and move to the bigger issues. Because every time you try to do something bigger, this very personal, this very humanitarian issue is right in your face, and you've got to solve this before you can move on to other things.
Is this a question of the Canadian government saying this is the line we do not cross? Like the we don't negotiate with terrorist line.
I don't know. I've negotiated the releases of Canadians all over the world, and ransoms are always paid. How you pay the ransom and when you pay it. We had a case in West Africa a while ago that where, in effect, the agreement was, yeah, your Canadians are going to go back home. The local government says, we'll pay the ransom on your behalf. But then within a year, our development program increased with that country. There's, these kinds of practical matters, there are mechanisms available to you to solve them. And it's the unwillingness, I think, in this case, to use those practical measures. That's why this thing has gone on for so long, because it scares me. Because it scares me in the sense that the bigger issues can't be dealt with. We just changed foreign ministers here in Ottawa, and he was locked into the existing system. The new foreign minister, Mr. Garneau, I don't know, might have a different approach here, and others might decide within government, other parts of the government saying, well, let's get this off of our books. We just can't keep going with this big rock right in front of us that we can't get over and we can't get around it, but let's remove it. And it can be removed very easily.
So, what I'm finding intriguing, Gar, is that you have these practical steps, these practical responses to these current dilemmas and situations, these impasse, and yet you don't shy away from using terms such as, well, the Communist Party is, horrendous, and that, atrocities, and then with the situation with the two Michaels, this is, it's hostage taking, nothing short of kidnapping. I mean, you don't shy away from these terms. And yet, I think the best word we can use here is realistic. You have a very realistic approach. And I think you even coin a term, realistic engagement.
Yeah.
Right? And so is this an example of realistic
engagement? This is an example of it. You've got problems out there. We do this in any number of other areas, but for some reason or another, people dealing with China and the way China has acted here, they're reluctant to concede the point that China is going to gain an advantage here. My point is, if you don't solve it, China has got the advantage and we can't do anything. You solve these kinds of problems, and we do it all the time. I mean, in disarmament issues, the other issue that's facing us right now is for Mr. Biden, is Trump's decision by the United States to withdraw from that nuclear agreement that the European Union, Russia, and China all signed on to, and the United States, and he left it. He didn't like it because he said there's no guarantees after 15 years. It buys you 15 years of a country advancing without, in fact, using its resources for nuclear purposes. Today, what have we got? Iran is well on the way to can build the bomb. They're 20%. I think the Iranians are more adept at, how can I put it, at these kinds of issues and how they play than the Americans are. The Americans seem to be locked into a box that nobody had the key to. And that was Mr. Trump, because things were so personal as far as he was concerned, that we've lost 4 years. And they were important years as far as the world is concerned. And that's hopefully now with Mr. Biden, things will change. But again, you need the Americans themselves have got to change. They are not the power that they were 10 years ago. It's as simple as that.
Okay, can you elaborate on that? What in your opinion then do the Americans need to do? How do they need to change? I mean, we already touched on this here, but in terms of their ideology and the application to the rest of the world, but can you be a little bit more specific?
Well, the very first thing that you start with realizing that the American armed forces have been based on being able to fight any number of wars anywhere around the world. But if you look at the history in the last, going back to the post-war period, every war that the Americans have engaged in, major wars, they've lost. They have not, because one is that their military policy is such that, okay, we've got a problem in Vietnam, or we've got a problem in Koreas, or we've got a problem in Iraq, or we've got a problem in Afghanistan. Let's send in the airborne divisions and we're going to solve it. But look at the history. Disasters in all cases. They won the war. I was down there when they invaded Panama, but that was an easy one, which was basically an extradition treaty to get rid of Noriega, and he died a few days ago, or a few weeks ago. But then they invaded a small island in the Caribbean because some of the medical students that were doing a cheap medical degree down there, and basically made no sense. But you look at the big ones, they're stuck in Iraq, they can't get out, they're having trouble getting out of Afghanistan. Syria is on the edge. The Iranians, they can't seem to get any sort of a reasonable approach to. And if you go back historically, then look at Vietnam, which was a disaster for the American people. And you can't have a superpower that keeps losing wars like this on this scale, and the effect that it's had on the American people. You've got to change that approach to the world. And there's other approaches can be used. The Americans don't, big powers don't need small enemies. But they also think that they've got to create enemies in order to maintain an effective military force. And the scale of the American military is, I don't know, they've got a dozen aircraft carriers, which they have more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined. Although the Chinese are building at a rate that are going to catch up with them. I think the Chinese have got 3 out there already in a matter of 2 years. The Russians have sold their aircraft carriers to other countries. So it's so, and an aircraft carrier, my God, we should have costed this sort of thing in terms of the American economy. The reason why you don't have a decent medical system in the United States that is somewhat similar, they call it socialized medicine. It's nothing. This just means that people just get the treatment, medical treatment that they deserve. Is that the amount of money that they spend in military terms and in security terms, they can't afford it. Whereas we're looking at expanding, and the Europeans have done the same thing, but the Americans keep complaining they want the rest of it to spend more on military. We spend on our military an amount commensurate with what we think we should spend. And it should not be up to the Americans to decide we should spend more because they don't want to spend as much as they have been spending. So it's the Americans have got to change here. That's the big change. How the Americans change, that's where the new administration has got to come into play. It's a very complex, you see it play out even today. It's a very complex political system. 4 years down there, I can tell you, it was really a fascinating period to watch this thing up close in terms of what Carter was trying to do, and then Ronald Reagan shows up and the changes that were occurring. And this was in the aftermath of Vietnam, of course, the problems that the Americans created for themselves as a result of Vietnam, particularly the National Security Organization and the CIA was essentially decimated in terms of the role that it played in many of these things. But all of those institutions today, the CIA has got a diplomat in the State Department just been appointed as director of the CIA. And if you're familiar with the American system, these are the kinds of things that make you small. But the big one in the American system right now on the security side, of course, is the NSA, the National Security Agency. It's the guys that is moderating or not moderating, listening to your programs and saying, well, should they be saying things like this about us? I mean, that goes on. The sheer size of the NSA is just on. But we've got a similar, smaller organization, just here in Ottawa, but it's nothing on the scale that the Americans have. And this whole business of technology and communication, as you know, the world has got to come to terms with. It's one of those issues. I mentioned it in the book. I got tired of this, and I've got to include this as an issue for the world to deal with. It's out there. Communications, it used to be when you picked up your phone and you wanted to call China. My God, it was an adventure in maybe not. That's how it worked. But now, you want to chase a moose around Newfoundland with a cell phone, you can talk to somebody and send them the sound of the moose, the sounds of the moose. The technology is just beyond our ability to deal with. So
yeah, and you mentioned the 2 cornerstones of our modern technology were the creation, the development of the jet engine and satellite communications, right?
Yeah.
and that's the basis. And that all took off right near the end of World War II. I mean, jet
right,
and planes were starting to be introduced,
right.
and satellite communications just revolutionized. I'm talking to people around the world, in data transmission and this. I did want to ask you a question about that. What are China's goals then in terms of technology? I mean, there's talk about them wanting to dominate AI, artificial intelligence systems,
Yeah.
and that some of their involvement with social media includes data gathering, and I'm just wondering, what about how do you deal with that when China has stated that they want to have the most advanced artificial intelligence systems in the world within the next several years?
Yeah. And I have no doubt that they will achieve it. I think it works on two levels here. One is the use of this kind of information for commercial purposes, economic purposes. But then there is the use of this kind of information, whether it can transfer for use at the political level. And that's where it gets really dangerous. By and large political decisions by governments need to be made by people, not be driven by technology where there isn't a hands-on kind of approach. And an awful lot of this stuff that has been gathered in AI, the fundamental element in all of this is that by and large, humans are not directly involved in this process. And that is really where really, I think for commercial purposes, we can all live with it. But when you move it upstairs, is this business of the politicization of this kind of information to drive a policy that is politically useful for you. That's when you're going to run into trouble. And that's already happening to some extent. The big charge in the United States, of course, for years now is that the CIA would doctor its assessments of the world to meet what they understood Mr. Trump wanted. It happens. I'm sure the same thing happens in Ottawa, but it's of no consequence in Ottawa. Intelligence in Ottawa plays a very minor role in terms of what we do and don't do. We are not in the same league whatsoever. We've got an armed forces now, but again, what are we down to 80,000 or so? We have trouble getting the regiment together if you have to go fight a forest fire sometimes. Although we've fallen up the group now, and I guess in Latvia, this is part of the NATO advance as far as Russia is concerned, which is still an issue that needs dealing with, because the Russians have never gotten over the idea that once their own buffers disappeared on them, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and all of those countries, they've all sort of looked westward rather than eastward. And the Russians are not particularly happy with this sort of thing, but their problem is more their internal, they've got a makings of a democratic system that is yet it's been corrupted by the use of money. And it's much more raw than the use of money in the American system in that sense. Where money is used when you look at the Senate seat of the United States these days, sometimes you're talking $1 billion, which is unbelievable. But yet it tells you something about the power that goes with being a senator, and that's why it's so expensive. But all of these kinds of things come together. Money is, the man just died a few days ago, Mr. Adelson, he owned all the casinos around the world, essentially. Las Vegas, Macau, Singapore, and all of this sort of thing. One of the 36 or $37 billion in his own personal funds, but he drove American policy by just the use of his money. Remember 2 years ago, the Americans moved their embassy in Tel Aviv, which is the international standard, into Jerusalem, which we've all been reluctant to do because Jerusalem, as an issue, is not been settled in terms of the various wars that have been fought. And yet, Trump through a $25 million upfront donation right at the very beginning when Trump was being organized, and that brought him a place in the White House that led to the Americans moving their embassy into Jerusalem 2 years ago. So this is where money plays this nasty kind of a role. And for big powers, or when you get leaders like Mr. Trump, who doesn't have much money himself, less than he brags about, but that's another story.
Okay.
The money is out there and the Russians have got a problem here with money as well.
Well, I mean, we certainly.
China does too, really. In another way, China is that they're going after the amount of money that some of the new billionaires in China have made. Even the party, the Communist Party, are getting nervous about these guys and the role that they may play. But yet, there's some effort underway to rein them in. But we want to be very careful. Some of them are also very powerful people in terms of the economic benefit that they create as far as the Chinese state is concerned.
Well, we certainly see the influence of big money here in the West with big tech, big pharma, and the influence that they have, right? And certainly there's definitely an influence on free speech over here. So on this end, you've got money and companies controlling speech to the point where the exiting administration can't communicate with many of its adherents on social platforms. For instance, the recent banning of Trump's accounts permanently on Twitter and Facebook doing something similar with various conservative groups. But then in China, you get the government is influencing social media and sculpting it, and customizing it, right? For lack of a better term.
Yeah. But here, I think in terms of the states, the inability of the Americans to come up with any sort of law that will govern the use of social media. And I have no sympathy for it.
Yeah, what's up, Gar? What's up with that? Poland just enacted a law, didn't they? Where they can find companies that are deemed to be interfering with
that is of no consequence in terms of that larger issue as far as the big ones in the States are concerned. The problem that they've had a free run on, if you like, the channel, the systems by which in effect they develop and the people that use them. I don't think the Americans will ever put in place, unless something magical almost happens, that's going to provide any measure of control.
Why?
If you go back and look at American history, it's not new in the sense if you go back to the turn of the 20th century in terms of the size of the corporations down there in terms of the railroads and the industrialization. And the Americans came in with a series of laws that basically brought them into line with, in effect, establish a pattern of behavior that was appropriate for the roles that they were playing. But there's nothing the same, nothing in place for the large social media platforms today. They're there. And nobody wants to touch them because it works both ways. Trump has been using the media, the social media, is one of those most effective tools that's available to him. And there are other politicians who say, well, Trump can do it, I can do it, and that's it. The trick is, I think Mr. Trump, there was no governor there in terms of his own personal behavior. And as a result of that, that's why you've got a vote going on right now in the House. I guess they vote to impeach just about now, or will later on today, with that impeachment. And that is more in terms of personal characteristics. But the other element, of course, a lot of the politicians in Washington, particularly on the Republican side, who have ambitions for the next presidential election in 2024, they would like to see Mr. Trump eliminated from any possibility of being of any influence in that election. So this is where you get Republicans showing up now and willing to. It's just the Democrats and seeing the end of Mr. Trump. The game gets cut gets played at many levels in the United States. And the one thing that I think saves the Americans is that their media is still first rate. You get two or three good newspapers, and they're rich enough that they can do anything that they want to do by way of the kind of
Which
research.
ones? Which newspapers are you?
Well, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles one, and there's two or three others around. A lot of them have disappeared. Just we have nothing left in Canada hardly at all. The Globe struggles with it, but the Globe and the Toronto Star, which used to be a good one, in fact, they've run into financial problems, and it's a question of whether they're going to be around tomorrow and that sort of thing. Whereas in the States, they've turned three or four of these papers that are national institutions, and they will do the job and that the Americans need doing sometimes in these kinds of large issues. But whether or not you're ever going to get a set of laws in the United States with respect to social media standards. Poland can do it, no trouble whatsoever. We could probably do it here as well, but it doesn't matter what we do. Twitter is proposed. And the funny thing is about all of the countries that have sort of tried to cut off those social media platforms, where they block them from being available in the country. Mm-hmm. Just every one of them eventually come back to allow them to be. They find that the utility of those kinds of mechanisms are such that, there's.
Yeah, I mean, they were there. We need them now. We can't do without them.
Yeah. And you try to make a point that India is the other one, which is on that track. That is, we haven't mentioned India, but in this process, as far as Asia is concerned, India should not be counted out. What is surprising about India is when we talk about political systems, the Indians have given themselves, you think we've got a federalism that is troublesome. The Indian federal system is just amazing. The number of languages and religions, and the number, it used to be, I think at independence, there were 17 states. They're now, I think, into the 30s. I think they're up again. And within India, the big issue is usually always language. Yeah. And so what they've done is divide states and establish states on the basis of unity of language, and that has helped in many instances here to manage the state. And the Brits left create or help create what the Indians perpetuated was a central system that is where the central government is very powerful and can take over and run states. We theoretically we could do that in Canada, but there isn't a politician in this land that would ever attempt to say we're going to walk into a provincial capital and take over because the local government doesn't know what to do. But in India, that works. We're going through a particular period right now in terms of demonstrators are showing up here just about 2 blocks from where we live, right here outside of the Indian High Commission. Largely the Sikh community in Canada, and all from Punjab, who do not like changes that the Indian government is making in terms of the pricing of agricultural products in India. And they're out protesting every day, and they've been there now for 10 days, non-stop, which tells you something about. Well, we used to get, as far as China was concerned, we used to get competing disputes with people supporting Beijing and people supporting Taiwan would show up and demonstrate. And that has died down to a certain extent in Canada now because of the power of the Chinese embassy. It's quite profound. And just about the migration today from China into Canada is pretty much from the mainland, and it's not done for political reasons as much as it used to be when it was done for 40 or 50 years ago.
Wow. Gar, I'm going to bring it back to the steps required to deal with China. You've come across as, China's there, it's going to be there. This is what they're up to. This is how we need to deal with them if we want to make progress. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but we already discussed what the U.S. needs to do, how they need to change, in your opinion. Okay. You talk about the role of Canada and other countries, and you coined a term, united democracies. Can you discuss this for our viewers? You mentioned a number of countries getting together and creating a united democracies front organization.
Yeah, that's happening. And what you're trying to do is when you use those terms like democracies in this kind of a context, you're looking for a commonality that is will bring the countries together. So the Europeans certainly are natural allies, and there's a bunch scattered all over the world, even some from Latin America, Brazil, or Argentina, or the Australians, or the Japanese. And there's the commonality is the nature of the government and its relationship to its own people, where there is the people have a chance to, a fair chance of changing the government, and they do in any number of instances. It's part of the product here. So what you're looking for is that commonality in terms of, and from that commonality, can you make the next step, which is the difficult one, identify a bunch of countries that could work in this area. It's relatively easy. It is getting them to work together where they all would have slightly different interests as far as China is concerned.
Can you give us some examples of that? Slightly interest.
China is the second largest trading country for Canada, but you say that, but then you start knowing that 75 to 80% of everything we do in this country just goes a few miles down and crosses the border. The economic of Canada coming up and suggesting things as far as China is concerned is relatively easy in terms of the pain that it might cause you. Whereas for other countries, you take a country like Australia, they've been trying to play this card themselves in terms of policies that they've taken towards China. And they are backtracking like mad right now because they need like a number of coal, wines, fish, any number of products that are essential to Australia's economic well-being. China is the principal market for it. So and Australia and New Zealand are sort of equal. New Zealand is in the same boat to some extent, but it's not as large. But this all goes back to 1972 when they all had what we've been called as British preferential trading arrangements. But then the Brits, when they joined the European Union in 1972, those things disappeared. And so Australia and New Zealand have been out creating markets for their products all over the world. And China is now predominant in terms of its importance to them. And for Japan or South Korea or Vietnam, they're all a large economic interest as far as China is concerned. How far they're prepared to go in terms of coming together and saying, okay, this is what we should do in common in dealing with China. That is really where the difficulties are going to come with those specific policies. Where you start, I'm not sure. I think you go back. You got to start on the economic side and try to make sure that China is firmly involved in the rules established by the World Trade Organization, for example. You start with there's a commonality of interest between countries of trying to have a common and understandable set of rules by which in effect you buy and sell from each other. That is, and if you've got somebody like China, which for years everybody said that the Chinese manipulated the value of their currency in order to advance their economic interest, well, a lot of Americans would argue we've done the same thing with the Canadian dollar. So I mean, this is something that countries do, but they do it less today as a result of a set of rules that have come into play here. And you've got to start with that kind of an approach here. If you're going to start with the idea that we are all great democracies here and we deal with our own people, but China's got to change its political system, it ain't going to work. That is something that it's down the road and it's doable.
You think so? I think that's one of the big differences between, say, your approach and maybe a potential Canadian approach, and then what's been happening with the U.S. I mean, you commented on U.S. and Russia having similar approaches to trying to dominate and hem in and how we need to change that. And can these huge powers, I mean, the U.S. I'm talking about in particular, come to that conclusion and accept that what you just stated, where you can you enforce, can you avoid the idea of trying to impose a democracy on a culture, first of all, that's 6,000 to 7,000 years arguably of history, right, civilization, and this entrenched governmental system, which you even admitted to the atrocities and such. And I mean, look what happened recently, just a few days ago. The lead investigator in looking at the organ harvesting in China just got an award, and so when this is making a headline, how do we reconcile that with, our approach to dealing with, I mean, is that one of those small things like the hostage taking, the kidnapping, or is it a bigger thing that's always going to hang over it? Like, how do we reconcile these events with moving forward and being realistic, as you were saying, in the treatment of China in order to make progress, be inclusive of them on the world stage, because it looks like they're going places anyway, right?
Yeah, one of the basic rules of diplomacy is that after the soldiers have a go at trying to fix things, who do they bring in to fix them? In the long term, it's always negotiations and diplomats that come into play here. Force, whether it's economic force or whether it's military force here, doesn't change very much. You've got to go in and talk and talk and talk, and it's not easy negotiating with other countries. You look at the European Union and you look at their history. God, how long is it? I can remember when they did a poll in the steel community way back in the 50s. And it's now, what have they got? And the big debate right now is the Brits backed out, the silliest mistake that the Brits ever made in their life, and they've made many of them, is the idea that we're going to go out and we're going to become sovereign again, which is absolute bullshit. It doesn't work that way. And the Europeans have got something going for them right now, which is 500 million people sitting down in Brussels and negotiating with each other in terms of commonalities that they need in order to occupy this bit of space. The rest of the world, it's an example, it's the only good example. It's the world has seen, actually, that kind of thing. But the United Nations, in another way, provides a foundation for some of these same things to go on the economic side, on the health side, and what else we need, management of aviation, say, for example. All of those kinds of things are done through a bunch of people sitting down in a room and talking to each other. It is not done through the use of military power or force. Once you go on that route, you're just not going to get there. It's as simple as that.
One of my brother's best friends in high school ended up, I believe, working for the UN, and he got very interested in, and I think it was the Foreign Service, and he was always politically oriented in high school. Very nice guy, very easygoing guy. I could see him as a diplomat. His name was Ben Roswell, and his older brother was actually Mark Roswell, who was big mounted. He's like the most prominent Western celebrity in China, right? And he ended up marrying a Chinese national, having children there. And I remember when we were young, he was a little older, and he said, I'm going to go to University of Toronto and I'm going to study Mandarin, and then I'm going to China and I'm going to be famous. And he did. And I mean, he was like 17 when he said that. We were a little younger. And so So Ben's older brother became Big Mountain, Dashan, and Ben. I don't know what happened to him, but I know he was involved in diplomatic circles. But I always wondered what was going on behind the scenes. And here you are talking about it takes a lot of talking
Yeah.
and negotiating.
I mean, the added tragedy of the two Canadians now that have been locked up. I mean, the focus on their lives was to do exactly this. I mean, Michael was in our foreign service, even leave of absence. You know, he has spent his life studying China with the idea that you can contribute to just this process. The other guy, the other Michael, is the wolf. I mean, he is concentrating in North Korea, you know, of just getting people to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And because at the end of the day, I mean, the soldiers don't work. I can't. I mean, and whether when I use the term soldiers, I'm being generic here. And hard line approaches to think that you're going to change somebody. The United States can pressure Canada. Yeah, they do it from time to time. They do it they don't use the soldiers, but they have a way of going about it, or from other countries, and that you can get your way. But in terms of a country like China, I mean, you've got to work with them,
right,
not against them. So it's that process. How do you get it going? Right now, you've got to go back to where things were. Obama was trying during his administration, not that long ago, that the Americans were working on all of this. And the idea that for some reason, some people even argue, well, the Chinese, they don't even understand democracy. I look at Singapore. I look at Taiwan. I mean, these are democratic countries in every sense of the word. You know, they've worked things out here. It's a bit larger with a billion four, but it can be done.
So, Gar, then I want to ask you about that. So then what role, if any, do you see members of the Chinese diaspora, worldwide playing in the current, attempts to relate to and include and evolve with China? Do you see any at all? Because there's a lot of bad feelings there, right?
Oh, there is, but I'm not sure whether it's as the bad feelings are as bad today as they were back, let's say, 25 years ago. And this is when the Cultural Revolution was going on, and sort of thing. I mean, and that just, those were internal Chinese policies that made things a hell of a lot worse for the people of China themselves. It was their own policies that did them in. But today, it's a much softer. I watch a fair bit of the news in Canada, for example. The number of professionals that show up to talk to us about the COVID-19 situation. Look at their names. They're Iraqi, they're Syrians, they're Chinese, they're Japanese, they're Polish. And the one thing that we've gotten right in Canada is this idea you can create a multicultural basis towards our country. And the number of, I can remember visiting a hospital in Newfoundland out on an island called Trinity, which is off the northeast coast of Newfoundland. And we got a hospital here. And this was back 30 years ago. Every nurse in that hospital had come from the Philippines. Mm-hmm. This is, we help each other. The Philippines have got people. For example, and there's absolutely no reason why, if they want to come to Canada and work here, boy, let's use them. It's getting over this idea that we've got a piece of space here. We're going to sit here and tell the rest of the world to bugger off. That's not what Canada is about. We are, and this goes back to the role that we played in the First and Second World War period. Pearson played a large role in all of this, and several other Canadians. And I think the large set of international law that was written, the first draft was written by a Canadian, and we've been playing this role. And to some extent, for a brief period of time, we came forward with ideas on our own that we promoted and spent the energy on. These things are not easy. The acts where these treaties went on landmines, and then the International Criminal Court that were created. These were Canadian initiatives that have added to that body of institutions that can help the world make progress. I mean, the idea that you can charge the head of state with a crime and have him locked up in Brussels, or right now they use the jail it's in Amsterdam, or Den Haag, and to lock them up there and put them on trial and sentence them to long periods of time. You know, this is a monumental change in the way the world operates. Landmines is a more practical problem. This is the residue of wars. And nobody ever cleans up their landmines. So you need, in effect, an institution that travels the world and takes millions of these things. I mean, every time they have a storm down in Nicaragua, down there on the border between Nicaragua and Honduras, these bloody landmines wash out, and there they are. And the kids go, kidnap them, nothing else. And some of them that were made that they looked like toys. In Afghanistan, the Soviets left behind landmine fields where you look up and it's a little toy, you pick it up.
My God.
You know, this is a kind of thing, but these were things that Canadians did, you know, for a period of time, and we've done nothing since. This goes back now 20 odd years or more. But we should be doing this sort of thing. We have the resources, we have the talents to be doing these kinds of things and playing a role here. But it just doesn't seem to figure into the agenda.
So, you know, you've laid this out for us. Your book goes into great detail, even enumerates the steps, and the majority of the book elaborates on what steps you feel need to be taken. What would be some of the consequences of not undertaking this approach?
Well, the real danger, you take a country like Iran, that suddenly Iran decided that it's got nuclear weapons, and in effect, deciding that they will use the fact that they've got nuclear weapons to try to gain greater influence in the Middle East. Israel has got nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia will have them before you know it. The UAE will have them, and suddenly you've got a proliferation of nuclear weapons. And the one thing I think more than anything else that the world has got to do is to build down. For the longest time, the Russians and the Americans were building down their nuclear arsenals. Trump has walked away from some of those treaties. We've got to create a climate in which, in effect, the ownership of nuclear weapons is not an advantage to anybody. And for North Korea is the other one, this sort of thing. But North Korea is, I think, with some effort, can be brought into come into play here.
Isn't that what Trump was trying to do? Isn't that what Trump was trying to do when he
yeah, but two guys sitting down, scratching their asses, talking to it, bullshitting each other. That's not how these things work. And what you've got are guys who are in the back rooms who are working out, and so that in effect you put in place the rules of the game here. And for the rules on nuclear, nobody should have them. The world has decided that years ago. You've got to walk away from nuclear weapons. These are real game changers here in terms of if they ever get used in that sense.
All right.
The use of them creates an effective time. So you've got to look at that, and that requires dogwood. How long did it take the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, the European Union, and the United States sitting down with Iran? They were, I think, close to 7 years getting that treaty in place. And what happened was Iran said, yeah, we'll ship all of our fissile nuclear material. They shipped it off to Russia where it was destroyed, and said, we're no longer in the nuclear game, and totally changed the dynamic in terms of many things. Well, the dynamic is back on the danger side of things right now. And all because Mr. Trump decided that he didn't like, and whether he was, because the other element in all of this, Israel does have nuclear weapons. It's simple as that. They've got them there, and Everybody said, well, or the Israelis said, never be first use. Well, you never know. The availability of weapons like this. So you got to, people have got to sit down, have a plan, and work on all of this. And it's not driven by electoral periods. This is a problem in the States here. In 4 years, geez, you're never quite sure what you're going to get again. In Canada, a 4-year period. For these kinds of problems, you've got to have continuity over a considerable period of time, but there has to be a national consensus that this is what you're going to do, and that becomes central to your policies that you're following.
Okay, so threat of nuclear intervention is there and looming if we don't do things right, and I mean that kind of makes other things seem kind of small. But I'm going to address the woolly mammoth in the room because we've already talked about some other things, and you've been very gracious here, and I really want to get your opinion on this. We're in the midst of a pandemic here in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. We're instituting tonight at midnight another maximal lockdown, and it's a stay-at-home order essentially for us. So for the next 28 days, unless you're essential, you can't go outdoors without fear of getting fined or worse. So in that context, the worldwide opinion of China's involvement with the COVID-19 virus, can you comment to that? Do you feel that they're being treated fairly, unfairly? Does it not come down to the use of those words at all? Because you've taken a very realistic approach. We may not ever know for sure what transpired at the biosafety lab level 4 in Wuhan. We may never know for sure the US's involvement or lack thereof. Can you please speak to this for our viewers, Gar?
Two elements in this one. One is the Chinese have already cooperated on, and I mentioned earlier the release of the genome.
The genome, yeah.
Absolutely essential. That is what's created the worldwide medical miracle of producing the vaccine.
But Gar, there's even talk that genome was, from potentially from a virus that had been identified years ago, but had never been published. And so there's suspicions as to whether or not that's the actual genome.
Yeah, there's always people who credit, but the reality is that information came into the international system by China that allowed a whole bunch of professionals
to
sit down in the laboratories and work. Not only professional medical professionals, you've got companies themselves. You've got Pfizer, you've got Bayer. They're all out there working on the same thing. And if there was anything wrong with that genome, that basic information, we would have heard it in spades by now. We wouldn't have a vaccine. So let's accept that as a reality. The second thing that the Chinese have done, of course, is in terms of the treatment of the people who came down with the disease and how they continue the disease. Now, I don't think we can do a lockdown on Toronto, for example. That ain't going to happen. So we've got to look at other lesser ways, but in terms of the lessons that come out of China, in terms of how to contain the spread of this disease, there are elements there that in fact we should be listening to and talking to the Chinese about what the effect of it, not only in terms of the large social things about wearing a mask and distancing yourself and washing your hands and things like that, but in terms of in the hospitals themselves, what are the systems that you're using here to cure or to when people get sick and they end up in your hospital? What are the techniques that you're using here to cure is to help? They've had numbers that were larger than I think the Americans are going through this now, or the rest of it, they're just catching up on numbers, and our own procedures are getting better. But the Chinese have had a lot of this kind of experience, and their experience with SARS too. They've had the other virus that came with the swine virus now. So they've had a lot of experience in this area. You want them into the international system, sharing this information basically with some people are always suspicious of other governments. It's the nature of governments that people get suspicious. You don't believe anything that the American government says today for the very reason that they've been wrong for so long on various issues. But after a while, when professionals get together and they talk to each other, and they are talking to each other, every now and then you get a story of somebody, oh yes, he trained with me 20 years ago in a hospital here in Canada, or I've gone out there and I've visited him. That kind of experience is there, and it's got to be used to further how we're going to deal with this. I'm optimistic. I don't think there's any it's some, I think, reasonably finite period. This thing is going to get knocked on its head. Now, how long it's going to take is going to be a bit of a problem, and how quickly we recover from it. But the world has gotten much better on that. If you look at the 2008 economic crisis that we went through, how quickly we came out of that based on the kind of policies. Economists are in a category like weathermen. They're very right completely, but they're right for most of the things that they tell you to do. The consensus emerges in these large professions. You rely on people like that to give you the advice that you need here in terms of how do you get out of it, what do you do by way of policies here to make sure that your economy recovers as quickly as possible. And I think, there's no reason to be pessimistic at all here. And I think that the more China is involved in these kinds of things, the better we all are, including China. In China, I think there's always an element in China that's practical in this area. They'll work it out. I still think the classic one is I was negotiating a treaty with them back in 1997, and this was on the eve of the British leaving Hong Kong. And we're sitting down in Beijing and having good discussions. I drank some tea because that was good for me, but that's another story. And we sat down and we said, what happens here when we run into trouble here and somebody gets arrested and gets thrown in one of your jails here? How can we rely on sort of normal procedures taking place? And the guy I was talking to was pretty senior in the Chinese system. He said, we've got a rule of law in this country that will guide us in terms of this sort of thing. The concept is not foreign. The former Chief Justice of Canada spent many a day in China and in Vietnam talking to people about judicial systems and things like this. There's some of these things going on, and the Chinese system is, I think, getting slightly better. It's not as good as anywhere near you would want it to be, but things are changing. You can't have an economy the size of China and the success that China has had based on idiosyncratic decision. You've got to, in effect, sit down and say, okay, and part of your decision making has to be taking into account the rest of the world. You get relative statements on both sides that get made here. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, look where people end up rather than where they start sometimes in some of these disputes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's doable.
That's a huge cornerstone for your work.
Yeah, but I think it's doable. I mean, when you look at this, I still think it's worthwhile, and hopefully people will read the book. I've got a fair bit in there in terms of what went on during the Second World War and after the Second World War to create these institutions, and they've been, I think, immensely successful in terms of giving us a world today where poverty is just, it's down now in the hundreds of millions, and before it was billions in terms of around the world. Those kinds of things are there. And the health of people all around the world is much better now than it's ever been. So these things is as a result of those kinds of, that kind of institution building. You need good institutions, and we think that your people are dedicated to the purpose, specific, whether it's aviation or health or postal unions, or postal mail goes from one place to the other. And some areas, and we talked about it earlier, in the areas of the social and new media, if you like, that's an area that needs attention. I think for us, somebody's got to sit down and start working on it. Why? Who's going to do it? I don't see any, and the sad part of it all of this, I don't see any um, interest. I shouldn't say interest, not probably the right word, but any inclination on the part of Canadian politicians to get involved in this larger role.
So if we shift to a conservative government, you're not optimistic
No, no,
about
no,
the approach to China. Okay.
no. It's sad. So many of these things are driven by the individuals that come into play. We go back and how many foreign ministers have we had in the last 10 years? Jesus, monster. And these are unique people who have some sort of a vision. Sometimes it's a very specific thing, like Mr. Axworthy had on the court, and he had an official with him, a lawyer from Foreign Affairs they worked with, and that official became the first chief justice of that criminal court.
Mm-hmm.
They had to negotiate. It's called the Treaty of Rome. The Americans fought this one because they don't accept the fact that the possibility of somebody on their side might end up in the dock in this court. And but the rest of the world has it, and it's living with it. And there are other things that can be done, but I don't see any great rush to I'm getting too old to rush to the walls and working on these things. I can write about them, but the energy level is fading.
Well, ultimately, I mean, this interview is about promoting you and your book and your ideas as well, right? And when the Toronto Business Journal wants to do that, wants to give a platform, and I'm very glad we did this. And, you know, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm going to ask you one more question, Gar, because I know it's been almost 2 hours now, and I could listen to you forever, really. I mean, your experience is just so obvious, and we've got to do this again sometime, okay? We've got to do this again because there's going to be changes in the world, and I'm going to want to hear your opinion on that as well, and I know our viewers will. But ultimately, your message is one of, shall we just say, slight optimism that it can be done, but you're just not sure who's going to do it. And you've laid out a prescription, essentially, in your book of what needs to be done and the attitude and ideological shift that has to occur, specifically among the Americans, and then among countries that have commonality, this democratic commonality, or the commonality that you mentioned it, and then combining resources and forces in order to be inclusive. China's not going anywhere. We can't talk about a regime change. You've already admitted to certain things, and yet your practical advice is really coming out. And it's not an infomercial for China or anything. This is what we need to do. Because almost 1.5 billion people, and then you've got just a little less than that in India, and then you got this friction between them going on right now. This is not going away anytime soon. And so we either get along or we're going to be in serious trouble, right?
And it's the fundamental issue here. It's in our self-interest to do so. You know, this is, sending soldiers off to Latvia. Yeah, that should be a temporal thing. We are very temporary. But the thing is, it is putting in place some sort of, because we haven't talked about the situation in Europe, and I think
one of my best friends was serving in Latvia up until recently, and the son of one of my good friends is there now. We just shipped.
Yeah. But if you know your European history, the Baltic states, of course, have always been a thorn, and for the first time in their history, they've got a personality, an international personality that gives them some and support from the international community for their continuation. It doesn't matter what the Russians do. And the Russians will play any number of dirty tricks. We see them doing it in any number of places. But by the same token, the Russians can be a force for poverty and can work the system in a different way than some of the rest of us can. We look at Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's going on. The Russians are playing a very large role, the role that the Russians played vis-a-vis Iran on the nuclear thing. And then the Chinese can. You get those kind of issues, that's how you build and you affect the trust within the system. And the Russians it's in their interest. I think we got to complicate it. Canada could get lost in terms of territory. we drop down in the middle of Russia. It's so huge and so enormous, and it's going to be a force in one way or another in as far as the rest of the future is concerned. I think we've got to talk, talk, talk. And you've got to have professionals doing it, who know what they're doing, and that's the beauty of what's going on in association with the fighting that went on in the Second World War and after the Second World War. The fighting was there, but there was a whole group of people that said, okay, what happens? We've got to put together the institutions that's going to make sure we don't have to do this again in another 20 years. That's the key.
Gar, I want to give you the opportunity now to address anything that we haven't talked about. Maybe talk about something you've never talked about before in an interview or in your books, or something that you have that you feel needs more emphasis. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll do a very narrow personal thing here. I spent 30 odd years in the Foreign Service, and the Foreign Service consisted of people who, you know the system, you write an examination, you come in and you stay. It is a service. And basically, you work over a considerable period of time. There are really suggestions that that has disappeared. We don't have a foreign service anymore. It is, how can I put it, less of a service than a place where people come to work. And they stay for a while, and they're going to send me to someplace in Africa, and I don't want to go there. And so I can go and get a job with somebody else, and they don't stay around, and you lose expertise that you really need. And there's a very special expertise that you need in dealing with other countries. I used to go in and deal with Idi Amin. And I always see the bulge on his side here where he wore his 45. And we'd sit down, and I even went swimming with him in the hotel. He was a good swimmer.
Oh, and wow.
We sat down and talked to him, and we not made a great expectation that we're going to change anything. But when you had a problem that maybe you needed some help on, and the fact that people knew you were talking to this guy in his government, they were more willing to help you and this sort of thing. So even the bad guys that you have to deal with these they come with their need for management and this sort of thing. And the Brits tried for years, and Idi Amin, it's kind of interesting in terms of how that one got solved. Idi Amin decided that it was a bit of territory that belonged to Tanzania along the eastern shore of Lake Victoria. He says, the Tanzanians, they don't know what they're doing anyway. I'm going to take that bit of territory. And the next thing you knew, the Tanzanian army was in Kampala, and Idi Amin was escaping up to Libya. We sort of, how you get your solutions in some of these sort of things. But the idea that Canada or the United States or England would go in and take over Uganda, it ain't going to work. Whereas Tanzania, okay, he's causing us trouble, we're going to look after. And in that sense, that's how a lot of these kinds of problems, and the same thing happened in Central America, the wars down there. It was in effect the leaders of those countries themselves who said, look, we've got to fix this. And that's when they decided if they were going to do something, that's when we can come in and support them and give them the help that they need to change things. And that's how the world operates. And I think more and more, that's how the world operates now. And then you've got to take advantage. But the idea that we can go into these kind of places and make the changes, it didn't work 100 years ago. It's not going to work today either. So, but you've got to support the good people who want to change themselves. And you can identify. There's always good people in these kinds of situations, and those are the people we should support.
Gar, I think this is probably a good place for us to sign off if you're in agreement.
Yes, I agree.
I want to thank you. I very much enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you did as well.
Very much so.
And on behalf of Agora Media and the Toronto Business Journal, I want to thank you, Henry Garfield Gar Pardy, retired Director General of the Consular Affairs Bureau for the Department of Foreign Affairs here in Canada, multi-time ambassador for Canada, author of Afterwards and the most recent book, China in a Changing World. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
I'll put in one plug. The current book I'm working on is called Post-War Wars.
Post-war wars?
Wars. All of the wars we've had since 1945, we're looking at those for the commonalities that are there. And what have been the solutions? A lot of them, because I'm old enough to remember talking with the countries of the Balkans, that was a problem that would never be fixed. And in a funny sort of way, the Balkans are now sorted out. There have been troubles, there's no doubt about that. But boy, it's a different place than what it was 20 years ago.
You allude to the wars after wars in your first chapter of China in a Changing World. Actually, you do.
Yes, and we always deal with them as individual things.
Right.
A lot of commonalities here. And I'm going to come back to the commonalities here. What worked here and what didn't work.
Right.
Why some of them still go on, like the Middle East. Anyway.
Pattern recognition. Do you have a website or a link that you would like to share with us? Is there anything out there that would allow people to get more information about you besides your books?
Yeah, if people, my email address is the best way to do it is garp@rogers.com.
Oh, I'm so tempted to make the joke, the world according to Garp, but whoops, I said it, sorry. Not original.
I'm smarter than the original Garp.
Of course, yes.
But it's easy to remember that one.
Okay. Couldn't help myself. Okay, stay there. I'm going to sign off. I'm Dr. Sam Dubé on behalf of Agora Media and the Toronto Business Journal. This has been a wonderful interview with Henry Garfield. Gar Pardy, thank you once again, sir. And on behalf of myself and everyone out there that is watching, I wish you, Gar, Godspeed, and hope the viewers will join us again sometime. Thanks again.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.